Good morning and welcome back to the Explicit Measures podcast with Tommy, Seth, and Mike. Hello, everyone, and good morning.
Good morning, gentlemen, and happy Tuesday.
Hello.
Good morning.
Well, jumping into things today, our main topic for today will be an interesting topic. I think we're going to have some differencing of opinions here. We'll see where this lands, but it's going to be kind of talking through the conversation around Dataflows Gen 1 versus Gen 2. What are we seeing are the gaps? What's happening here? And what are we seeing for adoption? Is how are we using it or not using it, or what do we need to see for it to be more widely adopted? So we're just going to unpack the discussion there. But before we get into that, as always, we have a couple announcements. So, Tommy, you brought us a couple links here. So there is now officially a full Microsoft Fabric conference recap. Jason Himmelstein has done a great job of just summarizing all the details that come out. Really good article, good summary of all the main key items. Anything that stuck out to you, Tommy, that are important?
I thought you would have said the NFCs now with Power BI mobile apps. I don't know if you saw that.
I did see that. I didn't see a demo of it by chance, so I'm not really sure if it wasn't also in the main. It was announced. It was for Power BI, but it wasn't really in the main announcements area. So they have like the keynote kickoff kind of the. They didn't talk about it there, so it was kind of more of a hidden feature there. I maybe could see some use case for this one, but it feels a lot more like manufacturing. So kind of a niche thing. I think this is also very similar to what you were doing with QR codes and Power BI. Neat feature, kind of works, but I don't see a lot of people really just jumping in and diving into leveraging QR codes with their reports. There is use cases for it. Just I don't have any clients that I work with that need it. Any other things that stood out to you guys if you read through the list here?
I certainly haven't gotten into it yet, but the one that stands out very large to me is the Databricks Unity catalog tables available in Microsoft Fabric.
I do have some feedback on that one. So there definitely read the notes on that one for sure, especially the limitations. It's definitely a very good experience. So the idea here is Unity catalog exists in Databricks, and now you can just with a one button press, there's a new item. You can go get that Databricks Unity catalog bolted directly into it's like a new card, the new activity. And then you can just pick the tables you want from wherever that may live. And it makes a Databricks item with also a SQL Analytics endpoint and a default semantic model on top of those tables, which is great. It's nice. There's just a lot of limitations on what kind of tables you can use. If you're doing any kind of streaming, if you're using materialized views, you need to make sure you really check out the details of that. Because you'll find that some of them work and some of them don't. So you really just need a standard Delta table to pull from. You can't really pull things from I think
that's okay though. I mean, if as long as there's a working clean pass off point at announcement here, like
yes.
I think that's doable. I mean, and I think in general, for customers that are deeply engaged in big data activities, Databricks is probably the thing they're using. So paths into Fabric, I think, are the way that you start to explore opportunities. So it's cool.
One thing you'll also note, and I want to point this out in the documentation, they start talking about permissions and governance of the Unity catalog. You have it. There is going to be two permission systems. Basically, you have the Unity catalog permissioning, and you're going to have a Fabric permissioning based on those tables. So today, the way the connector works right now is it's not pushing down credentials of the user into the Unity catalog to see which tables you can or cannot see. It's a delegated permission.
I heard some just like a lot of the other data sources, though.
Yes and no, but like if you do SAP, that kind of pushes user credential pass through. There are some Lakehouse things that do credential. So I think the expectation of the community is a bit more of we like the idea, but we really want to start seeing credential pass-through go back to Unity Catalog, because that's the message. The message is Unity Catalog is your single point of governance for catalogs and governance and who has access to what things.
Yeah.
So
there's a lot that goes into that configuration.
Yes, I think there's a lot more coming. So if they can get that worked out, I think it'll be really impactful and powerful. But right now, the way I see it is it's really helpful. Just be aware of some of the limitations.
You're so needy, Mike.
I'm so needy. Well, This is the challenge, I think, of getting things out the door quickly, because we need to have the features to be parity with things. But there's always like these, we get the feature, but we get like most of the feature, and there's still refinement coming later on. So I think it just feels like that's the pattern right now. We get a lot of the initial releases of things to get things out the door, and we're quickly waiting for like, okay, we're really close. Can we get a couple more things to refine and make this a bit smoother for us?
I know we wanted to talk about this last week, but I think one of the bigger things that went under the radar was announcing service principals support for Fabric APIs, which is crazy that this wasn't out before.
Well, and again, this is one of these like, here's a whole bunch of APIs. You can only use user credentials with them. And now we're getting like, oh, here's all the service principal stuff. And they're not all covered. There's just a lot more that have been covered recently. So I really like this. Super big feature here, especially if you use a lot of functions as well.
The first time I ever looked at the Fabric documentation for APIs, I was expecting some nice, like try it out here in the service. It was all in C# or C++. It was insane. Like it's like, hey, if you want to create a connection to Fabric, here's the giant C# code you need. It's like, where's this coming from? It's like, so
sounds like an opportunity to me, Tommy, for you to broaden your language skill sets.
I'm not even close.
There's a couple other things. So Tommy, I think you pointed out another article. So moving away from, so again, check out the announcements. That the link is in the description of this video. It's also in the chat as well. If you want to go check out the full announcements, all coming from Fabric Conference. A lot of really interesting things. Really good announcements. Again, a lot of these are improving our experience with Fabric. Really, really enjoying the direction they're moving here. Tommy, you had another article here around updating the Direct Lake documentation. Updates to Direct Lake documentation.
So Microsoft is putting a lot of work in how they actually go through their documentation in terms of the wording. For example, for the Delta Lake and Parquet, they're going to adopt that in terms of from a format point of view. They're going to accelerate some more things with OneLake with some of the documentation.
Mm-hmm.
And they're just trying to enhance basically, okay, we're dealing with not just OneLake, but we're dealing with Delta tables, Parquet. That's going to be our primary, gold standard. And we're going to talk more about Direct Lake. So some more enhancements. That's really good to see, because again, if this is the heartbeat of Fabric, this is incredibly important.
I would agree. And I'm also seeing a lot of notes. And do you guys follow Mim at all? Mim on like Twitter or LinkedIn or something?
Connected on LinkedIn, I think, yeah.
So Mim has been doing this really interesting thing. So there's been this language. I mean, there's a lot of these open source formats. There's Delta, there's Iceberg, there's Hootie, I believe, as well. Maybe some other formats that are out there. But Mim has been really touting on, I think it was Twitter, is where he's kind of making these messages. But he was saying it doesn't really matter what kind of data format your format is in. You can bring them all to OneLake, and OneLake basically deltafies them, makes a metadata layer on top of them, so you can read them and understand what's inside the file system. So it was really interesting to me to see, people of the community, and he's now from Microsoft, but going in and deep diving on, these are all the different supported formats that you can go get. And I think this is a great play. Leave your data where it's at. You're using Snowflake, great. You can connect to Iceberg. If you're using Databricks, great. You can use Delta tables. It lets you kind of keep the data where it exists. And the teams that are strong in those tools can continue to reside and build in those tools. So anyways, I thought that was a really good point. And I think Microsoft is putting a lot of investment around Direct Lake and Direct Lake things. I had some great conversations. I actually had lunch with Christian Wade for one of the days we were there. And we were just hashing ideas back and forth. And he was telling all the great things that are coming from Direct Lake. So Microsoft is very motivated to continue investing in Direct Lake. And I'm very excited to have the direction of that with what they're building. So very pleased about Direct Lake items. Another good article out there for that one. And then one thing I'll just point out here, Tommy, I was going over to your GitHub recently. And so this is actually a request, Tommy. This is a request from so I was talking with an individual over in Stockholm at the conference. And he's like, where'd Tommy's page go? I can't find any Tommy's GitHub pages. So Tommy, I think you have, you're rebuilding some things in GitHub. Some stuff has happened.
Yeah. Something happened, which GitHub is yet to let me know exactly what, but they actually suspended my account and I have had a ticket in for 2 months. Actually, I have 2 tickets in, and with a follow-up, gone through all the correct avenues and doors, and I've yet to hear back. So I'm recreating my GitHub.
So there's going to be a new
I
one
don't
coming
know
back.
what you could do on GitHub to, maybe it was a Python, maybe it was a Fabric notebook.
Maybe you figured it out.
Maybe there's too much AI on your. It was doing too much.
Tommy, you should hound them daily, because if you don't know what it was, and there's something in your GitHub repo,
you might just do it again accidentally.
Yeah, you might load up the thing that got your account suspended into the new one, and that one would get suspended after all this work.
So yeah,
I'm trying. I think I have a lot of my local repos or my repos on a local computer, so I'm going to try to transfer them. At least the ones that I created that I have, they're not trademark or anything. They're just things why people are asking. It's very sad losing some of the guests, but yeah, if you go to the account handle for Puglia BI, that's the new one.
Okay,
it's a little barren.
All right, good.
But I'll plan.
We'll get there. We'll get it launched. It'll get going. Okay, excellent. All right, well then, Puglia BI will be the new one. So for those of you who have been following Economy Advocate and are following all this, you won't be able to find him at Puglia Thomas anymore at GitHub. It'll be now Puglia BI, which is awesome. It now matches your brand a bit more. So you can push towards the brand.
That works. So.
Excellent. All right, I have one more last item here, and I can't find where it's noted here on. I'm trying to find the September update. So in the September update of the Microsoft blog, there is introducing the Fabric metrics layer. I don't know if you guys kind of caught this one. If you search that article for the word goals, what about existing metrics and scorecards? You'll be familiar with metric scorecards. I'm reading this from the article right here. They're not going anywhere. Scorecard metrics will now be renamed to their original name of goals.
No.
So
what?
We had so much pain about going from renaming of goals to metrics, and here we are. So the metrics hub will be this idea of creating a semantic model where you can pick various items and make a perspective of it, and you can give that to people to go build on top of. Now what they're doing is they're taking the thing called metrics and now renaming them back to goals, which is what they were originally named. It's funny to me. It just makes me laugh. So we're kind of waffling on naming schemas here, but at least we're going to have goals and now the metrics hub. And the metrics hub will be this new thing that's going to be out here fairly soon. I think the announcement's made. It's supposed to be rolling out. I believe it's in preview right now. And so the metrics layer is, this is what we talked about on the YouTube channel quite a while ago with Carly. Carly gave us a really good demo of what this was, how it's going to be used. There's been a lot of refinement and features. It's getting out the door now, finally. So we're very excited to see this come from Christian Wade's team. This is very much needed. Exciting to see this happen. But we're just be aware, your goals will now turn back into, your metrics will now turn back into goals.
It says this in public preview, and it was the third part of the paragraph. But have you seen a place to enable it? Or
I have not seen it yet. So I had to go check out the admin tenant settings. It's taking, it sounds like it's out in preview. It's supposed to be rolling out to each of the tenants. I haven't seen anything yet. So I'm actually very excited to get my hands on it. And I hope to have some feedback on that one pretty soon. I think it's actually going to be a candidate for another exercise here pretty soon. Yes, Andrew, I think you're also interested in seeing these metrics, the new metrics hub up here. Anyways, cool stuff there. I just wanted to point that out. I thought that was really funny that we're now waffling on names.
That's a good find, Mike.
Well, I read that. I'm like, wait a minute. We were arguing about goals and metrics before. Here we are going.
There was a lot of argument.
A lot of argument. I'm glad our argument came out, and I'm glad we just landed on goals. It's going to just be goals now. So anyways, it is what it is.
Oh my God.
All right, enough of the things. Let's just talk about moving over. What's our main topic for today? Our main topic for today is jumping in, and let's talk about why would we want to use or migrate to Dataflows Gen 2 or stay in Dataflows Gen 1, or what's our thoughts here? So we're just going to unpack this is kind of a previous conversation we had in other podcasts around, what is lacking in maybe Dataflows Gen 2? Why would I not want to move my Dataflow Gen 1s over to Gen 2? And if there are any new features that we're getting in Gen 2 that we're excited about and maybe would want to push us more towards moving out of Dataflows Gen 1. Tommy, you gave us another nice article on this one. There's actually a feature overview. It's actually the differences between both tools. So you have a getting from Dataflows Gen 1 to Dataflows Gen 2. So Microsoft kind of gives us a migration pattern here, and it gives you a bunch of checkboxes and check marks here of like what we can and cannot do from the two different tools. So I think this is kind of the article we're going to start from. We're going to kind of go through this article together. Anything, Tommy, you want to add?
I think let's start with why we're actually having the conversation, and probably also the purpose of the Gen2 data flow. So this topic for conversation has actually come around because we've talked about this multiple times, not necessarily one particular episode, but during our announcements, the frustrations or what we've realized the limitations with the Dataflow Gen 2, our excitement for Dataflow Gen 2, and we keep touching this, but I think it's time to actually have the real conversation, the heart to heart on, okay, we may feel that some things are lacking in Gen 2, but man, Gen 1 is still out there and available. So let's probably start at the beginning or on the Dataflow Gen 1, right? Before Fabric, before everything, what did Dataflows Gen 1 solve?
Good question. I mean, I'll throw a couple key points that I think that was the solution there, right? Dataflows Gen 1 was really our Power Query solution in the cloud. It was our move from, instead of doing it in desktop, instead of making those common tables, I could then easily produce those tables directly in a Dataflow Gen 1. And the neat part is it would save the data. So a couple other features that I really liked about Gen 1, and we'll find these are very similar to Gen 2. As I ran my Dataflows Gen 1, it would connect to a SQL database or some backend server. It would then save that copy of that data down to a storage account inside Power BI. And then anytime I want to access the data from the Dataflows Gen 1, I'm not going back to the SQL server anymore. I'm just refreshing from that basically storage account that Dataflows Gen 1 stored information into. So it was basically removing load from the backend system. Imagine you have a dimension table, dimension products or product master. If you want to reload that data in 7, 8, 9, 10 models or refresh a data set every hour, no problem. You could have the data flow run one time at night. It would load all the new data. And then throughout the day, as your semantic models refresh, it's not always going back to the SQL server, causing additional load. So if you're trying to really load things out of production or get out of the operational systems, you can remove that additional accessing data load off of that machine and then only give it to Dataflows Gen 2. So those are the kind of key features. Anything else I missed, Seth or Tommy, that you really liked about Dataflows Gen 1?
No, I think you're hitting it pretty on the head in terms of what the game changer was for Gen 1 Dataflows when they came out. Was we had reference tables, master tables, just trying to get a source of truth that we can reuse, but utilize a business user case with Power Query. Before Dataflows Gen 1, we had Power Query in Excel that we load, and it'd be able to, just because Power Query was at the time the best way to do it. And we finally, the amount of solutions we were able to solve, both from having one source of truth from multiple Power BI users, or for myself, I'm always going to reuse the customer data. I'm always going to reuse our reference for our sales quota. That was great, but to do multiple transformations over that as well, and then I just have a static, I don't have to load the whole thing table, really changed from a governance and also how we looked at Power BI. Because before, like, the Power Query file, the query that we use, it's in this SharePoint folder if you want to get data. So that by far, and we love Gen 1 incremental refresh host. So like it had some amazing features out there that I know for myself, I was dependent on.
Yeah, the great thing about it is centralizing the systems of processing, right? Like up into a place of shared, the shared ecosystem, as opposed to, like Tommy's pointing out, the many different various local or, local solutions that people still had to come up with.
I mean, think about loading that. I mean, in my example I gave earlier about the product tables, having a master product table that you're loading over and over again to many different models. Every time you do that, it requires some level of compute from the semantic model to go back to that source system. And you're kind of almost overspending a little bit, right? You think about like, wow, I'm going back. If I refresh this model 3 times per day, I'm always going back to that source system. So when I'm spending money on my SQL, either Azure SQL or on-prem, I'm making that machine give me the data, right? So that's one expense there. But then you're actually potentially running your semantic model refreshes that run longer, potentially. Another thing that was a challenge was we didn't really have the ability, or in the early, back in my day, back in the early days of Power BI, we didn't have the ability to create incremental refreshing on different tables at different speeds, right? There's certain tables that need to be refreshed very frequently, and there could be other tables that refresh slowly. Again, back to my product master information, right? If I'm looking at transactional data, I may want to refresh that multiple times per day. But if I'm looking at a product master, that may be something that actually refreshes much slower. So Dataflows gives me the ability to have 2 different data flows on 2 different speeds, right? I could make separate tables refresh at a different cadence, basically, which is, again, another time savers.
I do like that point about it's almost putting guardrails on some of the production systems, right?
Yeah.
Because especially in self-service scenarios, right, where you have people creating connections to SQL servers, et cetera, like China. Power BI, I've always described as like a bull in a china shop when it comes to data access. When it comes to data access, because it's just like, whoomp, like the things it can do, depending on how many different queries are in the Power Query, it's just like, boom, there goes the SQL Server resources to like suck things up. So especially when you throw in ways to limit the data the data sets that you're accessing through incremental refresh, even, right? It helps those systems maintain operability for sure, while you still have access to the data then in this other store.
And one thing I really want to point out here that I think is a big differentiator that is going to create more friction when you go between Gen 1 and Gen 2. When we think about incremental refresh, the incremental refreshing inside Dataflows Gen 1, I think, was very well done. You had the ability of creating a incremental refresh poly that would do a drop and replace or an update old partitions mentality. And I really liked the Dataflows Gen 1 incremental refreshing structure. It was built super solid. I understood it. It was easy to let people, to teach them, like, hey, I'm going to make I use the analogy of like a snake, right? I have a year's worth of data, and I'm always going to refresh the last 7 days. So I'm going to add one more day to the pipeline, and then delete and replace the last 7 days, because there's always this. Sometimes transactional systems don't get all the final records for a couple days because things get synced and transactions come in, and so sometimes you want to just kind of recently replace those things. So the ability for me to drop and replace individual days of data using Dataflows Gen 1, I think, was extremely helpful for me, and I really liked that feature. The reason, when we start talking about Dataflows Gen 2, you'll see why I'm pointing this out specifically. Anything else for Dataflows Gen 1 that you liked? Crickets?
There are obviously the frustrations, but honestly, they also came out with the ability with the Gen 2 or Gen 1. Mike, you actually made a note of this initially, was that the Power Query in Dataflow Gen 1 was updating with features before desktop. And I thought that was really interesting too, where it's like, oh, it's actually I have more features available to me than I do in desktop in the service. So that also kind of was a major help as well. But no, I think that's a pretty good kind of use case for where Gen 1 where it plays.
Cloud first, man.
Cloud first.
Once something goes to the cloud first. You'll always get the most recent stuff or the more newer stuff in the cloud.
That's true. Agree there. So let me go through a couple gripes that I had. So I had a couple, with Dataflows Gen 1, yes, as good as we're touting it here, there was a couple, I think, weaknesses that I felt were a bit challenging inside Dataflows Gen 1. And I think maybe Microsoft's going to try and address that with Dataflows Gen 2. So one thing with Dataflows Gen 1 was the inability for you so when you started, there was this whole idea of like downstream or dependent streams. Do you remember that feature in Dataflows Gen 1 where I had I would load raw data using Dataflows Gen 1, and then I would do some transformations to it. So it would know, okay, this data flow has a downstream dependency on a secondary data flow, right? Load raw data, go to the tables, connect to it, grab a window of information, and maybe incremental refresh. And then Dataflows Gen 2, Dataflows Gen 1, you could then set another data flow behind it that had an dependency. So if you kicked off the upstream data flow, it would know there's a dependency downstream and then do the downstream activities. One, that was a pretty cool feature, but it didn't always work very smoothly for me. And it was kind of hard to determine like when something was starting, how many tables downstream were working. If I had two upstream tables or data flows that were triggering about the same time, there seemed to be some sort of blocking effect that like once you kicked off one initial table refresh, it blocked everything else downstream. So you potentially had sometimes kind of random errors of, imagine you have a 3-tier kind of data flow, right? Data flow 1 is loading raw data. Data flow 2 is shaping, transforming, cleaning up the data. And then maybe you have a third data flow that's kind of merging a couple data flows together. And anywhere in that path, whenever you started the most fundamental, the one that's the base of the pipeline, if you refresh that, every single pipeline downstream was basically blocking. It said you couldn't change the data. And to me, that was a little bit weird on why it was doing that. And it was not very intuitive as to what was occurring there. Anyway, so that was one of the challenges there. Who can edit the data flow? Like, I remember Dataflows Gen 1, I was constantly taking over the data flow all the time. Tommy would build one and then I'd need to make a change and you can't see this data flow. You don't have access to it. I'm like, why? Like, I'm not going to change it. I'm just looking at it. I just wanted to observe what was in the code. So to me, that was a little bit of a weird experience. And I think the last thing that kind of was weird is the whole publishing experience. Every time you made a Dataflows Gen 1, every table you made was a physical table that was written to storage. So it didn't really matter if you turned it inactive, I don't think it would write anything. But if it was active, every table became a physical table. And I don't necessarily need all of that. Sometimes I just want the data flow to build the logic and then produce, I don't need every single table in the data flow to produce an actual output of a table. But that was kind of the assumption with Dataflows Gen 1. Every Dataflow Gen 1 made a table. So I think it was maybe what I would call a bit heavy-handed in that it was always processing all the data all the time. I don't know if I need that. So any other gripes that I missed that you guys have, or kind of
you hit the ownership
edges?
You hit the ownership one on the head, and then also too, and I think Seth, you actually brought this up in one of our very earliest episodes. As much as I love Dataflows Gen 1 and can overcome a lot of challenges, it's not meant to be a data engineering or I think a data process center, because once you run the query, there was no really in terms of storage. If you broke the query, if something happened, that would break everyone's report, and there was no backup. There was no version control here. So it worked great, but you're still very at the whims of knowing what you're doing. And then, yeah, Mike, to your point, the ownership side of the collaboration was non-existent.
It was very focused on a single person building that item. Yeah. All right. We're about halfway through here. Maybe would be a good idea to transition over to the next part of this. So thinking about the decision guide for Fabric or the data flows, let's talk about Dataflows Gen 2. Where's that different? Tommy, give me some kind of bullet points here around where you think Dataflows Gen 2 kind of pops out. Your audio may be going very slow here, so something's wrong on your audio. I'll go over to Seth. Seth, how's what do you see are some of the different talking points for Dataflows Gen 2?
Yeah. Well, just what are some of the larger big differences between generating, going to Gen 2? And I guess what's interesting is it's you're all on your own. What's interesting, are you still with me, Mike?
I'm still with you.
Okay. Is it feels like a big platform shift as opposed to an upgrade to a new version of something, right? And there's probably a reason for that, because there was. But typically, like in the V2, you get everything from V1, and you don't in Gen 2, right? So
Correct.
I think in some respects that's a bit jarring, and why we're having the conversation around, like, are there still more applicable reasons to stick with the Gen 1 versus Gen 2?
Yeah. So I know I froze, and I don't know if anyone mentioned this, but I'm going to mention the number one reason with Gen 2 data flows where the game changer part of this is. So Sami, we already talked about this. I can push the data somewhere. I can actually push my Power Query to a lake house, to
The destinations.
The destination.
Yes.
Which is absolutely a game changer. So I can actually have storage in my own organization's data, whether it's in Fabric or it could be any SQL database.
So the options they give you is Azure SQL database. So if you have an Azure SQL database, you can pick things out of Fabric, push it back into that SQL server. You have a lakehouse where you can store the data. And this is on a table by table basis. So you can have 10 tables in the Dataflows Gen 2 and only write down 3 or 4 of them, whatever you think you need to come out of that data flow. You also can write data to Kusto, and you can also write it to Synapse Analytics or SQL DW. If I look at this, if of those features, the one by far I use all the time is Lakehouse. Lakehouse is by far the Dataflows Gen 2. If I'm using it, it's going to go to Lakehouse. But I also feel like something happened in the transition between Dataflows Gen 1 and Gen 2. Dataflows Gen 1 can be used in regular Power BI. You can use it there. Dataflows Gen 2 is now an exclusively only Fabric element. You can only use Dataflows Gen 2 inside Fabric, which I think makes sense because you can write data to the Lakehouse. That's a Fabric element as well. But now you're forced to kind of transition over to that new world. If you look at the feature comparison, now it's in preview, I believe, right now. Incremental refresh is announced for Dataflows Gen 2. But my argument would be is I really don't like the Dataflows Gen 2 incremental refresh. It's not cutting it for me because it only, I believe if you read the documentation, I'll go try and find the article on it and put it in the chat window here as well. Dataflows Gen 2 does not allow you to write into a lakehouse with incremental refresh. And the incremental refresh in Dataflows Gen 2 requires that you have a created date of a record and an updated date of a record, which in certain data systems, you're not going to have the updated record. If you don't have a data system that's tracking the updates or you can't trust it, I've had a lot of organizations, it's there, but they don't trust that the development team is actually accurately updating that record, then you have to load the table entirely every single time. And so the incremental feature is not as relevant. And I really want that drop and replace mentality that we had with Dataflows Gen 1. So I feel we had a regression, and then a pretty large regression at that in the incremental refresh area when we're talking about the Dataflows Gen 2. And that's kind of one of my major complaints about Gen 2 is it is not as easy.
No. Do you feel, so if Gen 1, and I wrote this down, or I thought I did, right? I did right in the beginning. What was the goal of Dataflows Gen 1? Tommy said, putting Power Query in the cloud. Who uses Power Query?
The business.
All the business users.
100%.
Are these two different tools for two different audiences? With the same name, but different generations?
That's a great point. I want to argue no, it's not. It's still designed. I mean, I still think it's designed for the business users. I think what I'm finding is there's more. I mean, what you're doing. So let me step back for a second. Dataflows Gen 2 is data engineering. It's data engineering for the business user. A nice, easy to use interface. I have very common transformations that I'm going to be doing. It's click buttons and things happen. Awesome. It gives you a nice list of steps. This is great. Any normal data engineering tool gives you a very similar experience now. Like Talend, other data engineering tools, they're going to show you
ADF. Like it's all diagram based. Yeah.
All diagram based, and there's sequence of steps that you do to produce the data. So I really think Dataflows Gen 2 is still designed for the business. However, we're now merging into more of a data engineering realm. And so I think Data Factory and data engineering has gotten their hands on a little bit of what's happening in Dataflows. And so, yes, it's still the same experience. It looks the same, but it's doing a lot of different things under the hood. And I think the jump from a business user in Gen 1 to a business user in Gen 2 is actually minimal. However, there are certain patterns that you used to do that you can no longer do anymore. And I think that's my biggest gripe is you can't bring me a new Dataflows Gen 2 and limit what I would call some of the most impactful features of Dataflows Gen 1.
Yeah, but isn't there a trade-off, right? Like
there is.
Even from what Tommy's saying, from the standpoint that if one of the major differences between Gen 1 and Gen 2 is I can push my data somewhere, I have a lot more control
totally
about, each table. And to your point, I can put one in this location, one over here, et cetera. So there's a lot more scalability. Like, like what are those trade-offs big enough, or are you still stuck in the realm of like, it's still kind of inconsistent from the way you would want it to work?
I mean, I think, well, let me give you another reason why I don't use Dataflows Gen 2, right? It's not just because Dataflows Gen 2 isn't a good tool. It really is a good tool. I think what has happened is I've also gotten a lot of other tools that are very competitive as well. So I'm going to lean on, I really like writing code in notebooks. Notebooks make a lot of sense to me. I actually know a lot of SQL. I've been doing a lot of SQL work over these years. So for me, writing some SQL code and writing some data engineering inside a notebook is actually a more rich experience. And if I compare the amount of time I spend writing, or not time, but if I compare the compute running a Dataflow Gen 2 job and then comparing it to what a notebook can do from a consumption standpoint, notebooks blows Gen 2 out of the water. It's just so much cheaper.
Is that really a valid comparison?
Yeah, honestly,
I don't think it is, because I'm a data engineer. Like, I'm doing more data engineering things, and I would agree with you, Seth. Like, the business user is going to use Dataflows Gen 2 because that's what they're comfortable with moving forward. But for me, who knows a little bit more and have done a little bit deeper dives, if I'm starting with Fabric and I've got an F2, F4, F8, I don't have a lot of capacity laying around. And if I start running into thresholds of like, I'm out of capacity, I think I'm going to start trying to, me as recommending to new users is go learn notebooks. It does all the things you can do and more. And if you're trying to integrate Dataflows Gen 2 with a pipeline, I can't pass parameters into a Dataflows Gen 2 right now.
It can do all things and more without any of the user interface that you can follow along with.
Not yes and no. I will say I'll also give notebooks a really solid argument. Notebooks has Data Wrangler, which is the Python version of Power Query for M. So it's basically, it writes functions for you. It does all the transformations you need, most of your common data transformations. And I would argue the Data Wrangler experience is actually a bit more rich than what you get in Dataflows Gen 2 it gives you a better UI to work with. So I'm with you, Seth. I understand. I'm making a very big, you're poking. It's a good point. It really is. It's a big jump to say, use this user interface and then go write a notebook with all code in it. Like that, to me, that's a big leap for business users. And I agree with you. But I do think once the users in the business start trying to get through that step, they find the notebook experience is much richer. I can do much more things with it. It's easier to understand the logic and the code that's being built there. And I see them with a little bit of resistance at the beginning, but longer term, they start finding a lot of value in it.
So I know, Tommy, you keep on jump in here, but I want to lean on one more thing though. Like do you think that a user coming in and using Dataflows Gen 2 would run into the same kind of, I'm not going to call them gripes, but things you don't like? Or does it require the context of using both platforms?
Good question. I think if you didn't know what Dataflows Gen 1 did, you'd be totally happy with Dataflows Gen 2. I think the fact that I had prior knowledge and had done so much work in Dataflows Gen 1 and did a lot of things in there,
sure,
I was expecting the same level of capabilities when I went to Gen 2. So if you're a business user, you're using Gen 1, just be aware there's some, I think, feature gaps that don't exist yet. Dataflows Gen 2 can do everything you need to. It might cost you a little bit more in CUs, but it doesn't do a there's just some missing features for me, and to me that's enough to say I need to look at other spaces, other tools inside the Fabric ecosystem that get the job done for me at lower cost with more flexibility.
Yeah, and that's why naming, once again, I think is interesting to me, because like this is the new generation of Gen 2, but it's not this. It doesn't feel like it derives from. And that was my point. Is like, so you're calling it the same thing, but it fundamentally operates in a different way, and it has different capabilities than Gen 1.
Agree.
So that's a little bit of a why I think there's some friction in even maybe making some of the assumptions that you are, right? Like,
yes,
Dataflows Gen 1 should do this. If you're calling it Dataflows Gen 2, it should also do that, or have some sort of thing that makes my life just as easy as it was in Gen 1. And I don't know if that's the conflict in and of itself, rather than saying here's a new thing, calling it flows. Nope, not that. Goals, nope. Metrics,
let's call it goals. Let's call it metrics. And those are some of the big things that I look at here. I mean, I think if Microsoft really wanted to be competitive with Dataflows Gen 2, right? I think that's a great tool. I think there's just a couple main missing features here. I think using pipeline parameters and pushing them to a Dataflow would be immensely helpful. That would also resolve my incremental refresh issue if I needed to do that, frankly. Incremental refresh only writes to SQL databases. It doesn't write to a lakehouse. Also a miss. Why on earth? Lakehouse is the thing I use all the time. Everyone uses lakehouses now. All the things in Fabric talk to a lakehouse. The fact that I can't incremental refresh to a lakehouse is like absurd to me. This is a basic feature that should have been there way earlier. So that feature harps on me. Yeah. Dataflows Gen 2 is more expensive than Dataflows Gen 1, is more expensive than notebooks. What costs so much more to make a Dataflows Gen 2 run? What's so expensive around that? Can we do something to make it more efficient? It's supposed to be like the new shiny Genflows Data 2 on the neighborhood here. Let's bring the cost down. Let's make it more efficient. Haven't we not learned something from building Dataflows Gen 1 that could make it faster or more efficient?
How much do you like? We're talking anecdotal. Did anybody do any testing, or have you done testing where it's like you can say, hey, Dataflows Gen 2 costs this versus a notebook run?
Okay, so I'm in terms of percentage. I'm throwing a lot of generic numbers out here. I've seen a couple blogs. I'd have to go dig them up, but I have seen anywhere between 30% to 50% more than running a notebook. Okay. So same job, taking a table, lots of records, picking it up, doing some transformations to it, and putting it back down. Anywhere between 30 to 50% more cost on the Dataflows Gen 2 versus just a notebook. Yeah, that has been enough that I've actually heard teams, and I'm seeing posts about their data team is saying, look, we know it's not effective for us to use Dataflows Gen 2. We're spending the time to teach our entire team how to do notebooks, so we can not do any Dataflows Gen 2 and only use notebooks.
But I think that is a valid thing. Like 50 is a little, but that's what to me, user interfaces and other tooling to help you get somewhere faster is designed to do. And if it costs a little bit more, then cool. As long as there's another option for me to not incur that cost. But yes, that requires time and effort. And that was my only point in this whole equating notebooks to Dataflows Gen 2 or anything in reality is like there's a learning curve, and you're investing time in learning those platforms and making it much more streamlined because you're mainly code focused as opposed to more UI focused. You know what I'm saying?
Yep.
Mike, I want to go back to something that we were talking about people switching to Python notebooks, and I don't think the overlap of both the type of person and more especially their skill is enough for someone to say that. It makes a lot of sense because, again, if you're taking notebooks, which I completely agree with you, by the way, it is a wonderful experience. How fast it's been, how easy it is to connect, grab data, and from a cost point of view and speed. However, a user and especially the business team, because if all this time Dataflows has been meant for someone who is maybe not developer based, well, I know how to change types on a date time. I can easily remove and add columns. If I'm going into this and going, I'm going to switch to notebooks because that's more cost effective and faster, but you're immediately needing someone either going to go through a lot of frustration on, wait, what's the difference between a Spark data frame and a Pandas data frame, and why do they behave differently with the data types? And I just want to change the data type from the, such and such. Where are all these commands? If they have Copilot in notebooks, if they have the F64, that's a huge help. But hopefully they know where to start to find, like, I don't even know what data I'm looking at. That's part of the beauty of Power Query is you connect the data and add a column, and I can see a preview of that column immediately, that live cache. And yes, you can do that in notebooks, with head or print kind of thing, but it's still like, okay, I know this is nested, or I need to see those values. It's much more difficult with that open canvas that is a notebook to say, one, you're going to either get very complicated or messy, or two, there's going to be a ton of frustration. The notebook experience is for someone who knows or is going to know notebooks, not someone who's just transferring from Power Query. I get what you're saying.
Yeah.
But, Dataflows is supposed to be I don't know Jupyter notebooks and I have not learned Python yet.
Agree.
But I can still push data to our lakehouse.
And it does that for a good majority of use cases. I agree. Like it's solid and it's there. I'm just, my opinion here is you now have thrown Dataflows into now a world of other data engineering tools, and now there's an option of choice. Before we had no choice, right? Dataflows Gen 1, just Power BI. There was no choice. It was Dataflows or nothing else, because that was the closest thing we could get to lakehouses. To me, the game changer has been not Dataflows. The game changer for me has been we're now getting semantic models with direct lake or Delta Lake tables in them, right? So that was when Microsoft did that move, that opened up the world for a ton of other data engineering tools. And so to me, that opening a standard of how they store the data and prepare it for the semantic model, that rocked my world. I was like, oh my gosh. I mean, Seth, we've been talking about this for years. I kept saying, why do I need a SQL server stood up just to load data into Power BI? I just want to be able to write a Delta table and just read it right into my semantic models. We 2 years before they even announced something, I was like, this just makes sense to me. Why isn't this just stitched together? And here we are. Now we have it. I'm like, wow. I think that was, to me, that's the linchpin of like, we don't have to store things in CSV files. It's more efficient. It's Parquet tables. That shifted the entire ecosystem and allowed Microsoft to bring Spark and Spark SQL and native execution engines and all these other, so now we have all these other tools, Azure Data Factory. These are things that did not previously exist inside the Power BI ecosystem. And so they've taken all this great Azure stuff and brought it to Power BI. And I'm like, great. Now I have at my full disposal anything that's data engineering.
I think you bring up good points, Mike, with that one. But where my mind goes is, if you're creating ecosystems that work with third parties, especially those that have been out a while, then your tooling's going to be compared against them.
That's true.
And maybe that's where some of the frustration comes from, related to like just going from Dataflows Gen 1 to 2. Is this the product should be evolving and keeping the best of what it is, not starting over every time you rename it. And I'm not saying it's starting over, right? And maybe this is the platform shift, to get to a place where you can play with all of these back-end systems, and you can scale it and you can build it. But you do bring up a good point from the standpoint that there's a much bigger ocean that you're jumping into when these systems can interact with each other, and that's a good thing, but it's also a bad thing. I think in some respects, because the product itself can be compared against those other tools as opposed to just being in a self-contained ecosystem. And you don't want to be there, right? Like the more these platforms integrate, I think the better off it is for Microsoft in the long run, because the Fabric vision has something that I haven't seen in other tools yet. It's just the breadth of everything that Microsoft has been doing behind the scenes for many, many years, but it's got the self-service component to it, right? And if we talk about, you even mentioned this last time, some of the learnings I'm doing around data mesh, like it is this idea that you're bringing more business people into this framework where you're able to easily discover the information that you want faster.
Yes.
And Fabric is developing that ecosystem. And I think the criticisms that come along the way are justified, but also will change, right? We'll probably
Agreed.
have in 6 months, we'll probably have another Dataflows versus 1 and 2.
I think you're right.
Don't ever use Gen 1 again. Kind of thing. But
I mean,
that's
I don't
that's
want-
the evolution of a lot of these conversations.
Yes.
I think even if I look back at my 360 previous episodes, like if we went back to episode 1 and just redid it.
Well,
like,
I kind of nailed
things would be
episode 1 though. Like,
different.
let's be honest. Like, I think episode 1 was like was dialed, and like I mean, much to Tommy's chagrin, Tommy hated my comment, but I think episode 1 was like, we are going to be in the cloud. It will be only in the cloud, and here we are doing more and more with all things Fabric only in the cloud. So
Power BI.
But you're right, Seth. I agree with you. If we look back at a lot of our episodes, we would probably have changed opinions as we've seen the tool evolving.
The tool evolves. The feature sets improve.
Exactly.
Naming gets corrected.
Yes, naming gets or brought back to what it was originally. I would, and let me preface a couple things, right? If the Dataflows Gen 2 team had done just 1 or 2 key feature changes early on in the process, I think I would have been 100%, even if it cost a little bit more to run, I think I would have been, yep, do it. Just use Dataflows Gen 2. I'm happy with it. I think the features for me that really made a difference to start exploring other data engineering tools was so we have a data flow, we have a parameter. You can make a parameter in a data flow. It's literally called the word parameter. The fact that I can't go to a pipeline and inject my parameter into the data flow before it runs, a customer, a start end date of something. The fact that I can't programmatically adjust that is just to me a major miss. And I was like, this is why pipelines exist. Pipelines exist to integrate with all these. It sets the orchestration. It sets the pattern of how you load data. I mean, I use pipelines all the time to move data around. It's a staple. And so the fact that it didn't integrate that one part so tightly with the actual pipeline piece, and I just want to call this out. Alex Powers did a great blog article in October of 2013. So it's been out for a while, but Alex Powers, it's not about the cell.com, had a great example of, hey, you can actually use a SQL Analytics endpoint or a SQL data warehouse to update a date and then use that date to consume inside the parameters of the pipeline. So you can do an incremental refresh from a pipeline. But if you look at his blog post, there's a lot of steps, and it's not just data flows in a pipeline. It's data flows, it's a warehouse, and it's a pipeline. So all these things have to be kind of bolted together to make it work. Again, to me, that was a major miss. The incremental refreshing part was another major miss, in my opinion. Like the fact that I can only write to SQL really limits the ability of me using that. And then the only other one I haven't talked about yet is Microsoft is really touting the idea of bringing everything to Git integration. And I can't tell you already, since I've been using it, it has saved my butt a couple times with people making changes to things they shouldn't have been making changes to. And I've been able to observe what has happened. It doesn't require you to be technically knowledgeable about Git. It just makes it easier for you to track your changes over time. And the fact that Dataflows Gen 2 does not integrate with the Git integration, it's going to be announced. So that was one of the big announcements at Fabric Conference that said by the end of the year, 2024, we're going to have Git integration for Dataflows Gen 2, which is incredibly needed. Again, there's probably a lot of technical debt that I'm like washing over and be like, oh, it's so easy. Just fix it and make it work. They're probably like, shut up, Michael. This is so hard. So I'm probably overestimating the assumption there. But those 3 things, I think, for me, really pushed me away from like, I can't use it yet. I'm not recommending it until those gaps get solved. And once those gaps are solved, I'm really going to be excited about using it again. Other thoughts? Any other things we should cover off here? We're getting close on time. We should probably do final thoughts on this one.
I think for me, yeah, go ahead. Do you have a question for me?
No.
You just say my name.
I did, because it looked like you were going to say something, but I can walk over you like I usually do.
Go ahead. Go ahead. I'll just sit here. That's fine.
I think what's interesting to me in the whole Dataflows 1, Dataflows 2 Gen conversation and pipelines that you're building are what is the purpose for them and where, right? Self-service versus enterprise. Are you trying to use it can you use it for the enterprise?
Yep.
Is it, data loads are too large and you're not. But the other thing in here is like there's so like as I think about an ecosystem, we haven't leveraged Dataflows heavily because we have always built things in the enterprise space.
Yep.
As a lot more of the self-service in the organization, grows, I think there are definitely opportunities there. But the other thing is just the sprawl, right? Like to me, it's I don't want to be using 6 different tools or have people just spin up their own things because it's so much harder to manage. So there may have been use cases for us to use the Dataflows platform, but we just haven't gotten there. And to your point, Mike, there are those few things like incremental refresh, parameter, like things I have in ADF. I'm not going to give up, right? Like, moving into different platforms. But I think that's what the adoption patterns could and would change when you seem to be going almost business led to a tool that could graduate to enterprise level, right? But we're just missing some of the key features in there right now. But you would need those in order to adopt a wider audience of usage.
Yes.
And I think, a lot of your points are valid. Jumping into notebooks, probably a little advanced for a lot of the users, but at the same time, what I do like that there are many, many options, even within the Microsoft ecosystem alone. And the more time and effort you put into, learning what those are and the capabilities. And I like that we're talking about notebooks a lot because I use nothing else as well. In that, they become so extremely powerful in your arsenal of like data movement, manipulation, reporting, anything, that it is really wild. So.
Do you guys, the only comment, Tommy, go ahead. It looks like you're going to say something before I say something else. Nope, you're not going to say something? No. Say something, Tommy, if you're saying something.
Say something.
So, hold on. Go ahead.
We'll just wait here patiently, Tommy, until you get your headphones so you figure it out. All right. Well, Tommy's not going to talk, so I will go ahead and say something else here. So the only other thing I can think of, do you guys like the new color for the icon? It's purple versus green. Do you know why it's green? More money.
Why it's purple versus green?
I don't know why. There's 2 icons the same color. It's a purple icon for Dataflows Gen 1, and it's a green icon for Dataflows Gen 2. And I was kind of like, yeah, it's green because it's fabric. It's they've fabricized it, so that's why it's the green icon versus the purple icon. Anyhow, with that being said, I think that's about a wrap for a Dataflows Gen 1, Gen 2 comparison. I hope you found some of these points valuable. I hope we've encouraged you to run some experiments around using notebooks. Maybe that would be relevant for you as well. Also, don't worry. I think the features are coming. So if you're not using Dataflows Gen 2 right now, and if you're looking at moving over to Fabric things, I think, hang tight. I think the features that we're looking for will eventually get there. Amir has already committed to having Dataflows Gen 2 inside Git integration by the end of the year. So that's another big win for us. And I'm actually kind of excited to see where the rest of this stuff is going to go. So with that, we really appreciate your ears for this hour of time. Hope this was helpful and a good conversation. I hope you're using this in your organization already, and help you evaluate whether or not you want to migrate from Dataflows Gen 1 over to Dataflows Gen 2. With that being said, Tommy, where else can you find the podcast?
You can find us on Apple, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. Make sure to leave a rating. It helps us out a ton. If you have a question, idea, or a topic that you want us to talk about in a future episode, head over to Power BI tips/podcast. Leave your name and a great question. And finally, join us live every Tuesday and Thursday, 7:30 a.m. and join the conversation on all of Power BI Tips social media channels.
Excellent. And with that, thank you all very much, and we'll see you next time.